listening today to the Oxygen Thieves. I'm your host, Gary, and we have Mike, Paul, and Nick with us today. Paul, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Hey guys, I'm a former police officer and I wasn't in the seat last week. I'm glad to be back. Really looking forward to the conversation today. I think we can dive into some good topics here.
Yeah, I'm Nick. I'm currently an active police officer, police supervisor, rank of sergeant. Just ready to get into it.
Yes, and I'm Mike, prior service Army medic. Looking for a good evening's conversation.
Yeah, I'm Gary, prior service Army, active duty infantry, served in Afghanistan a tour. In any case, today we're going to be talking a lot about some new revelations in the George Floyd video. And now we have more than just the single shot that we had from the bystanders. We actually have the perspective of two different officers out there, and it's the video I've watched, and presumably a lot of you out there have watched, is about an hour long, consisting of two different perspectives between the two officers. Now, it leads credence to a lot of how the police officers, in my opinion, behaved. And largely what they've done is by the books and standard procedures, and it gives you enlightens you on how things went down and how they got through the point to where they are.
Well, I think the first question I would ask is why was this footage not released earlier? And I know we'll discuss kind of the repercussions of that later, but I find it odd that in the initial aftermath of this, all we saw was a very small part of what actually happened, and that's what everybody reacted to. And to me, that's one of the biggest concerns that comes out of this is we only got part of the information.
And I think that's largely because you get the information from the public immediately. So if somebody's taken a video with from X perspective on whatever event, they can post it to the internet and everybody can see it, within a minute of them posting it, right? Whereas if you have a police officer's cam that may show all of his interactions during that, you may not get that for a while based on their internal politics, or how they're not necessarily politics, but maybe procedures on how they gather that information and then end up releasing it through the channels. That could take longer than that 1 minute after the event that somebody can post it or even live stream something. They can see it as it unfolds, on places like Twitch and all those others. But I find it odd that they waited so long. It was weeks and weeks and weeks before we seen this information, and I think there's heavy implications of how things went down. Why
Sure,
people
but
got so upset.
this original release of this body cam footage was not an official release. It was a leak. So it wasn't even the officials in the state of Minnesota were not even trying to release this information initially. And to me, that is a concerning point, because we had, this huge uproar in social media and then, into the real world, and huge riots. And at no point did they even try to put anything into perspective. And I have a big problem with that. If you compare that to a recent incident in Aurora, I believe we looked at a video that was released by the Aurora PD, basically instantaneously to show context to a viral clip that was out there of a lady being pulled out of her car. And
You're talking about that 4-second clip that turned into a multi-minute encounter after they released it.
Right. And so not to get into the details of that, but just using that as an example of maybe doing the right thing, showing this actual footage to be able to provide context to a situation that you may not have. And so what we're able to look at here is the actual contextual incident and put it into a perspective, instead of getting it maybe wrong from the eyes of the media, who have been perpetuating this incident since it began. And to me, that's something that we really need to dive into.
Well, something that I think a lot of the general public and even media fail to account for is that policing in its whole is largely done by the moment as the moment unfolds. So the decisions a police officer makes during an encounter happen as from his perspective and how the encounter is moving along. So if you don't account for those things when you're reporting on things or viewing a video, one perspective video, maybe a 4-second clip or whatever, you don't see how or why things are happening. It's not logical from my side to get too involved in it until you have a little bit more information to judge on that. And it seems like that's kind of what we went here and that other event that you talked about there.
Sure, and obviously, modern society is react first and not worry about the consequences. That's kind of where we're at as a society. Instead of looking at everything from a perspective of knowledge and actually looking at the facts, we maybe take a snippet or a statement that may or may not be true, or a video that doesn't show what led up to those events, and the whole world goes crazy. And that's kind of where we've gotten. We saw that in the Michael Brown case. That basically the media portrayal and the way that those events in the Michael Brown case were portrayed was that hands up, don't shoot, and that he was shot in the back, and that just is not the facts of the case at all. And so I don't understand why we have developed this rush to judgment in any case. The whole idea in the criminal justice system is an individual is innocent until proven guilty. But we've become, in the court of public opinion, we're not going to even look at the facts. We're just going to basically
whatever makes me
convict
feel
them.
good at the time.
Right. And so to me, that's where this starts, and this discussion starts, and kind of diving into maybe what we saw on the video and how that lends actual context to the discussion.
Before we get too far, we did talk about the Aurora incident, and I would like to at least briefly touch on it so people have an idea of what we're talking about in this context and in the Aurora video, so we can kind of merge the two together. So essentially, what happened was there was about a 4-second clip or so that got released of essentially a police officer ripping a young black woman out of her vehicle and then tossing her up against it and proceeding to arrest her, essentially, is what we got to see. But they released the footage, I think it's of the police car, actually, not the actual body cam, of the incident. And it shows the entire event and why she was pulled out of her vehicle. She was asked, I think, 20 times to get out of her vehicle. And I can't remember exactly what she did for the encounter. Do you remember, Paul?
Yeah. So just so everyone's clear, we're talking about Aurora, Illinois. This happened recently, within the last couple weeks. Traffic stop was conducted on a vehicle that had plates that did not match the car itself. So the vehicle was an Acura, I believe it was an SUV, like an MDX, Acura MDX, and the license plates came back to a Saturn car, or a Saturn sedan. And so that was the reason for the stop. Watching the video, then the police officer, I believe, states that he smells marijuana, and he, as you said, asked her repeatedly to exit the vehicle. He asked for her driver's license, which she would not produce. She was combative the whole time, and eventually was forced out of the car.
Right. And in that case, she ended up being charged with all the issues with her license plate being improperly displayed, including resisting the officer trying to conduct that stop. So the context here to relate to how George Floyd went down was initially this 4-second clip showed what looks like police brutality, because you have no idea of why he's doing what he's doing. But because a police officer may have to be physical during an encounter for whatever reason, specifically this, where they're non-compliant to the point where they don't want to participate in police officer trying to uphold the law, then they have to escalate things because that's part of their job, right? And
Yeah, absolutely. This officer in this particular video was extremely patient. I always said that I operated under the policy of I ask, I tell, and then I make. There's not a fourth option, right? And so I'm going to ask you nicely, and if you don't comply, I'm going to tell you. And if you don't comply a second time, the third time I'm going to make you. So, did I always follow that? No. But following the patience that this guy had, he was beyond patient.
yeah, and it largely the majority of the encounter is him trying to be peaceable to her, and he was never mean or aggressive to her. He was trying to perform his stop as professionally as possible. Had to go to a physical level to get her out to arrest her for being non-compliant the entire event. But to piece these together, you see the 4-second incident and you see the whole context, and it makes sense why he had to get to that point, because at that point she was getting arrested. That's just, instead of getting a ticket or something like that, she was getting arrested at that point.
That's correct. And he told her that you're under arrest. So but again, social media takes it 4 seconds of somebody being pulled out of their car, and it's a travesty, without looking at what's actually going on.
The other thing to add to that is it was not just a force. The clip was not just only him pulling her out of the vehicle. It was also exaggerated to where she had difficulty with walking. She was an ill person, and there's a whole big drama about how she was this poor, pathetic, weak individual as well. And so it was really exaggerated on him being abusive to a weak individual.
Right, and something to be said about people who will cut that clip down to just a few seconds to try to push a narrative. And I think that says something not just about the person who did it, but us as individuals who consume that content and come to conclusions based on that. There needs to be a lot more critical thinking involved, in my opinion, on not just these incidents specifically are meaningful, but in the criminal justice and police encounters and life in whole, like, there needs to be a lot more critical thinking here, because we're not doing that whatsoever as a society. We're jumping to conclusions and we're moving really fast ahead of facts. But let's get back into some of these George Floyd details.
One second. Let me jump in for a second here. I was just going to say, but that's I think that's where the media is at these days. I think some of the blame is obviously there. You're talking about, no, the attention span of the average viewer is not 25 minutes, right? The fight sells tickets. So the media takes the part of the clip that's going to be taken most out of context and shows it to people. If you put the whole 25-minute video out there or whatever it comes to be, people aren't going to watch that in its entirety. So the media definitely plays a role in a lot of the stuff that's going on, with really just showing, taking everything out of context and just kind of throwing it out there. And there's, there needs to be some accountability for that.
There's definitely something to be said about media accountability. There's laws that were repealed and such, but don't want to get too deep into that.
Yeah, and I would also, I would dissent a little bit on the Minneapolis thing as far as releasing the George Floyd video. I'm assuming the one in Aurora, probably the investigation was up much sooner. It is not at all uncommon for a department to not release all the information until the investigation is essentially over. And the George Floyd bit is actually still happening. So I would say it's not actually. Now, there could be something to be said on whether or not maybe the footage should be released sooner in its entirety and not to be taken out of context. But it isn't uncommon, I would say. I dissent a little bit on that point, that for police to not release much information, much video, much of anything during an ongoing investigation.
I understand where you're coming from, and I've definitely seen that in other cases, even high profile stuff. But like you mentioned, there may be something to be said that some maybe information does need to come out, especially when there's a third party releasing data or excuse me, video ahead of point at that time. You know, you have somebody view with a however many minute long view, and so the public gets this perspective where you have this humongous perspective where the public's going to be biased to the 8 9 10 minutes that is actually somebody else posted online. Maybe there's something to be said about moving those images along to help alleviate some of the non-contextual stuff that you see.
Yeah, and it may not even be, and I don't know for sure, but in a lot of cases when you're investigating an actual officer or an incident that involves multiple officers, that is not coming from within a lot of times. And probably a profiled case like this is actually being handled by the attorney general or maybe even higher. So they may actually be the one controlling as far as like, hey, we're not putting anything out there yet because we're still looking into this. So, I mean, it may not even be in Minneapolis's hands, so to speak.
Right. And I think that's just a general term about how to handle things in this day and age, and especially within the last 5, 10 years or so. Everybody's got a camera, everybody can release the information. And in the last years, people can stream those events live. And if they don't have what leads up to things, then you get stuff like what happens with George Floyd, where you only have so many minutes of information, where how did the police get to where they're doing, and why are they interacting with somebody. If you see somebody from 50 feet away doing things versus somebody seeing the view from within a foot or two of the actual encounter, there's a big difference there on and why things happen.
Right. And without a certain level of knowledge about how policing works, like in the case in Aurora, somebody who is a layman who has no idea how the use of force works, even if you tell her 20 times and then he proceeds to tear her out of the car, that may still look to a lot of people like, I don't understand why he's doing that. She hasn't done any. But that's actually where you're at. That is something that you can do. You're past the point of, I'm going to wait for you to make a move, so that there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of ignorance on how policing is done in general, even if you had the full video for
Well,
context.
we've talked a lot about in past episodes about passive resistance. And I think this is a big topic in America that you don't see headlines about. Passive resistance. People need to understand what it is and how police react to it. Because a lot of these videos out there that you see that people say, oh, police brutality or the police are beating this guy up, doesn't matter who you are or where you are. You see it across the board, is passive resistance doesn't mean you get your way. That's not how you make police do what you want to do in America. They're allowed to uphold the law, and by passively resisting, they forces the police to to step up their use of force to accommodate you being passively resistant.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Paul said as far as, our policy actually states. So, if this guy's, this officer in Aurora says 21 times, we'll give him credit for, I need you to step out of the car or whatever the case is. Really, that's way beyond, our policy is actually three as well. It's state the need for compliance, ask for compliance, order compliance, and then use of force. So there's really only three strikes. So the fact that somebody's willing to go that, again, he's going way above and beyond to try to quell the situation without having to go that route. I think that's lost on a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that is a testament to the officer in general. I mean, he showed a beyond reasonable level of patience, and if someone is asking that many times for compliance, that's pretty evident that they really don't want to go hands on or use force in that particular situation. But at a certain point, you have to enact some type of compliance to end the situation. Plus I believe that lady was on the phone, so you have a potential of a situation getting worse. If people were to happen to know where she was at. So, to me, that the officer did a very good job. in dealing with that. And it's unfortunate that those type of incidents get splayed out into the public as doing something wrong, because he did not at all.
Right. And again, just last thing I want to say about that is I think that's actually far more common than the latter, where we get those 4-second clips of just the cop ripping somebody out of the car, or the idea of like, what you see on cops on TV. Most of the guys I've worked with, men and women, exercise that kind of patience all the time. There are many situations I can count. I would need my hands and feet where we've spent well beyond what was necessary policy-wise to try to put an end to a situation without a use of force. I mean, there was one I just had not even but a couple months ago where we were at the point where it was going to be a knockdown drag out to get this dude what we needed him to do, and we literally spent 45 minutes quelling that situation verbally without ever having to touch him. So it's far more common than we get credit for.
Most definitely. And, we've talked quite a bit about this Aurora situation, and this is all to relate to the George Floyd. The reason I say it needs to relate to George Floyd is because now that we have these body cam perspectives, it really shows us why things went the way they were. So the encounter ultimately began in George Floyd's vehicle. And they were, I don't know exactly why, or remember exactly why they were approaching him in the first place. It was related to fake bills, I think, counterfeit bills being displayed to a cashier or something like that. But ultimately, the police officer and was trying to instigate an investigation there, and he was being very non-compliant and combative. Ultimately, and we never seen that perspective from the initial footage. You really just see him getting stuffed into a vehicle and ripped out the other side, and then he's on the ground. Paul, in this larger video here, we seen the interaction kind of move along. What's your take on that?
Well, I think let's start with the initial encounter. I think is really important. Basically right from the jump, you have a person that is non-compliant. He's being ordered to show his hands. He's not doing that. He's basically not doing anything the officer is telling him to do, and Floyd is acting in a very irrational manner, and it starts right in the car, right?
I would
And
say almost delirious is what it almost seemed like. His interaction, even the initial interaction, there wasn't much. Whatever the police officer said to him, it wasn't really grasping it. He was just kind of reacting to the moment, is what it seemed like.
yeah, and he made some statements while he was in the car. He said something in regards to being shot. He said, "I got shot," according to the transcript, while he was still in the car during the initial encounter. And he, like you said, seemed delirious, seemed impaired for sure, and which lends to some of the discussion in regards to potentially the always controversial excited delirium perspective that some people talk about. And when you look at the toxicology report that shows fentanyl intoxication rather, and methamphetamine use, those things, I don't think that can be discounted. Now, I'm not an expert in excited delirium, but you were dealing with someone that had high levels of fentanyl in his system, along with signs of methamphetamine use in his system, and he was acting in a very strange manner, I think, to say the least. So you have immediately an encounter with someone who seemingly isn't really responding in a normal way in the scenario in which he is in.
And that's
right?
what I found so odd was the officers asking some simple things, trying to just talk to him, and he's just immediately goes from 0 to 100 in terms of reaction. He's freaking out that he's going to get shot by the police, or they're going to murder him, or they're going to beat him up immediately. And this is when he's still before they even take him to their vehicle. He's freaking out
Yeah,
as soon as
this
they
is
interact.
yeah. So the original officer that was at the driver's window was Thomas Lane, and you know that's who Floyd's originally interacting with, and yeah, he's being basically out of his mind right from the get go. And then once they start getting him out of the car, that's when he's pleading for the officer not to shoot him. Don't shoot me,
Right.
man. Don't shoot me. And Officer Lane, tells him, I'm not going to shoot you. Just do what I'm asking you to do. It's real simple, right? It's like, just do what I'm asking you to do. But he was seemingly so delirious that he just couldn't really comprehend what was going on around him, I don't believe.
And he had a passenger in that vehicle that was approached by the officers that had they did not get combative with that other guy either, even though they had an interaction with him out of that same vehicle.
Yeah, there was passengers in the car, and based on the transcript, I had a hard time understanding. One of the subjects was either in the car or someone that happened to be, somebody that was just a passerby, was telling Floyd to stop resisting. There's, hey, look, just do what they're asking you to do, just don't resist. And that didn't really help either. They're even, I guess either it was his friends or whatever, people were standing by there trying to get him to do what they're asking him to do, and he didn't. He just kept resisting and acting in a very irrational manner.
Right. And ultimately, the him not complying with the officer and being resisting, and this isn't passive resistance. When you're pulling your arms away and things like that, you start to step up the ladder of resistance, and that's ultimately why we end up going towards the police car in the first place, is because of this interaction that we're having here that ends up being kind of blown out of proportion initially for the initial encounter. So he's going to get arrested as presumably at this point when they're moving him to the police vehicle for resisting or something like that, along with whatever charges they're interested in bringing to him, or they're just trying to get him away from the car, maybe to calm down. Either way, the next interaction really that's major is as they begin to bring him to the police vehicle.
I just want to add a couple things there. The family had an independent autopsy done or whatever, and they found that there wasn't anything in the system. There's something he said there. I don't think that that's the case, but I know what people who are on the other side of the aisle are going to say. It could be excited delirium, when I look at that. That's kind of a controversial thing, whether that even exists. I mean, it seems like it does, but to me, just in my experience, if he had methamphetamines on board, that alone will do it. It causes extreme paranoia. He may very well have thought that he was going to get shot, that something else was going on. It doesn't really make you, they tend to be not very coherent. We see that every week where I work. So it's almost like a lot of times when people are on meth, they bring them in for psych evaluations because they're not making any sense. Their paranoia doesn't make any sense, so that makes sense to me why he would be acting that way if he does have meth on board.
Certainly so. And also, before we move on too far, Gary, one of the things that I think is important to discuss here is very early on in this interaction, he already begins to claim that he cannot breathe, right? Like very early on. This isn't like...
This is before he's on the ground.
Correct. So very early on in this interaction, he's already telling these guys, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. And so to me, that goes back to our conversations regarding, well, as an officer, what are you really going to believe, right? If this guy's just standing here and obviously he's talking to me, he's standing up, he's not slammed down on the ground with three people on top of him, and he's telling me that I can't breathe. Well, later on down the road, if he's saying the same thing when I'm fighting him, am I then gonna believe him? Probably not, right? Like from a logical standpoint, if he already is lying or what I perceive to be lying earlier, I'm far less likely to believe that later on in the encounter.
Right.
Not
Well, and this is where we're talking about contextual meaning, like why officers behave the way they do, or why people behave the way they do in general, is things leading up to certain actions. When you say you can't breathe when you're standing, maybe you can't breathe very well because you're losing your mind over the police being nearby. But the same goes if somebody's listening to you, they're like, okay, well, you don't look like you can't breathe. And then you go further down the road and you're still saying the same thing. It's harder to believe that you can't breathe, even if the case you couldn't breathe.
exactly. Now, that's not to say that he was not having some type of medical issue where maybe he was having problems breathing, right? And not to say that my perception is right, saying, "Oh, well, you're standing there talking, you're just fine. You can obviously breathe." Maybe he was having a heart attack or something that that I wouldn't be thinking about in that particular scenario. Um, but just to add context from the perspective of what you tell me right now doesn't really add up to what I see. So therefore, later when I'm hearing the same thing, I'm just looking at it like the boy who cried wolf, right?
Exactly. And that's something to be said about any type of interaction. You can account it for anything. And there's a lot of people out there that will say, well, if he says he can't breathe, it's a medical issue, so you should just believe him anyway. And there's something to be said there that if somebody's claiming to have medical problems, then you should pursue that.
Should also just to point out that the official cause of death was a heart attack, not
Right.
asphyxiation.
That's
So
Right.
according
he may
to
very
the
well have, because of the high stress incident, having drugs on board with fentanyl, and he may have started to have a heart attack, and that's
Well,
gonna make
let's
it
back up
hard for you to
here.
breathe.
We've kind of spun forward a little bit. We kind of skipped over the whole vehicle and the interaction with the vehicle and gone straight to when he was on the ground. Now let's back it up here and start. We just brought him from his vehicle to the police vehicle, and we're gonna stuff him in. What's the intent of the officer at that point is presumably to arrest him, but not we're not 100% sure yet, as far as I can tell. But as they're trying to put him in the vehicle, he becomes overwhelmingly combative for the situation for just sitting in the vehicle. And this is fighting, pushing away, grabbing things, just moving his legs around as they're trying to stuff him in. And Paul, you've mentioned that in police vehicles, a lot of times the rear window, you can even kick it out. So if you're being super combative in the back seat, you may try to restrain him even more to get him back in that vehicle. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think uh, not familiar with how equipped all of their vehicles are, but you may have just normal windows in a police car. Some police cars may have bars. I've seen prisoners in the back of a car actually kick the bars to the point that they are completely bent and broken, and they kick a window. So that's a real thing. And my encounters with that, a lot of times when you're dealing with the subject that's doing that, is when we'd end up putting them in a hobble, which would basically be a type of rope or something that has, maybe it's a leash, like a dog leash that has an ability to just quickly put it around their legs like a lasso or something to prevent them from moving their legs in that manner. And so I think that's something that is extremely common when you have someone that gets in that position, because the policy might say, well, you have to seatbelt this guy into the car. Well, how are you going to seatbelt some guy that's kicking and fighting you just to get them into the car? You're really going to be able to reach in and put your face right in front of their head to seatbelt them in? No, you're not.
Right. Policies are written with a variety of compliance levels in mind, and belting somebody in like that is obviously somebody's non-combative at that point, right? Because if you're stuffing somebody in, you got to arrest them somehow if they're combative or non-combative. And if they're non-combative, sure, you can belt them in and all that. But if they're fighting you, are you going to stick your head in there like you said and get kicked in the face and this and that? Doesn't make any sense. And that's kind of what it appears that was going on with the George Floyd there, is that they were fighting him, and they got him to a certain point, but he kept fighting them, and so they opened the other side and pulled him out. And I can't remember on the video, you see him, there's a certain interaction that takes place that really sends it off and really gets them to come around the other side and pull them through.
Yeah. And at this point, this incident has escalated well beyond what apparently they were, capable of dealing with in that particular time with whatever vehicle and whatever equipment they had. I don't know how well equipped that is if they have the old so-called paddy wagon that you can just chuck a guy into. But, obviously those guys felt we need to basically get this guy back out of the car, right?
Yeah, and the why they felt that way, that they wanted to pull him out of the other side of the vehicle. We're not going to know until they say their side of the events publicly. What we can presume is that they felt they needed to restrain him to an additional level while the events play out. And so they've pulled him out and they got him on the ground. And we've talked about it before, and we agreed that putting somebody's your knee on somebody's neck isn't a particularly good way to subdue somebody for long periods of time. But there's something to be said with the Minneapolis police, their policies, though. There's something, there's a something to be said there, because their policies have them doing that.
Right. And whether it says do that for 9 minutes, probably not. But, based on the most recent policy manual that I saw, that basically is an approved tactic from the way I read it.
Which leads you to understand how he got to where he has his knee on the George Floyd got the knee on his neck. It may have been approved in a certain way for their police department to use it that way. Now, ultimately, like you said, it may not have been approved or told that, hey, don't do this for this amount of time. We don't know the entire details, but needless to say, it does happen, and it is an approved tactic in the department, which is, it's hard to say what his real intentions are at that point if he's applying a tactic that is approved by the police force that he's under, and maybe he just misapplies a part of it, which is the time, and or maybe that particular circumstance he's not supposed to use it for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I think, in my opinion, I think everyone kind of agrees that tactic was not the best to use for that length of time. But I think my overall issue with this is just the discounting of a lot of the facts of this situation, right? And I think we'll get into the aftermath of some of this as well, but I think it's important to discuss maybe some of the other actions that these officers did that maybe kind of contradict what the charges ended up becoming. I think, again, if you watch the video or read the transcripts, that you'll see that Officer Lane specifically and some of the other guys showed a real concern about his condition. They obviously ordered for an EMS to respond. They were trying to determine what type of drugs maybe he's under the influence of. And again, the toxicology report showed fentanyl, methamphetamine, and actually cannabinoids, which is indicative of use of marijuana. So he also had that on board. And, he combined that with the autopsy report discussing that he had heart disease, hypertension, and a sickle cell trait. The reality of that health situation is that he probably was in a big, big hurt probably before the knee was ever applied to the neck.
Well,
You
I will
know,
say, I would have to say, and I'm not a medical professional by any means, but you look at all the conditions that he has, and even prior to the police interaction, you say he's got heart disease, he's got high blood pressure, he's got a sickle cell trait. I'm not sure how that affects your heart specifically. However, then you add all these drugs to your system, and so these all affect the way your brain works, the way your heart works, everything. It affects your body in a multitude of ways, and then you add in this encounter as a whole. So you're talking about things stacking up here, to against him as an individual in terms
right?
of a health risk.
And he had coronavirus. I mean,
Yeah.
he had the whole cocktail. It
And
seems like.
to briefly dabble into coronavirus, interestingly enough, not only is it a seen in respiratory, they have found blood clots in all major organs in some of the people who have died of it. So there's also potential cardiovascular issues going on with that. It may not have been an issue in him, but that is something to be said.
Also, couple that with the fact that fighting is not something that is light on your cardiac system. That's one of the ways to possibly elevate your body faster than anything. So, and also hard on you. So it's not just like going out for a ginger run if you have a bad heart. It's, you know, fighting is gonna
You bring up a really
put
good
you over
point.
the edge in about 30 seconds.
Well, you bring a good point. You look at professional fighters in boxing and MMA, and as they are predominantly boxing, you see these short rounds. There's only a few minutes long. You don't see somebody like back in the day, people fighting for 20 or 30 minutes long. That's people gas out very quickly when they fight. Even at the peak performance, people who have really healthy hearts are really strong, do it all day long, and they're used to it, and this is what they do for a living. They
Yeah,
still gas out quickly. And then
absolutely.
you bring somebody in who may or may not be working out, but who has heart disease, has high blood pressure, is on drugs. Of course, it's going to make his heart work harder if he's fighting. Fighting for minutes at a time. Even he's not just fighting for a little bit. He fights in his vehicle, then he fights again, big time at the police vehicle.
Yeah, it's gonna exhaust you very quickly. I mean, at one point you can actually see the officers dripping sweat, and there's several of them. So I would say to up to the point that where we're at with the video when I watch that, if I think about that from the position I'm in, supervising my officers, and we have to regularly review the body cam footage. I think they're gold up until the point where he starts, even with the kneeling. I think you're fine until you're not regularly checking his well-being. I know there's concern, but when they're not checking the pulse, making sure that he's breathing, I know that's not really their job, but if you're going to kneel on somebody like that and they're saying that they can't breathe or something, you need to make sure that that person is good.
I agree with you.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, I agree with you. Because if you watch the video, they didn't actually pull him out the vehicle. They actually got him in the vehicle and he wormed his way out the other side. They didn't get the door shut fast enough. They didn't pull him out. He wormed his way out the other side. If you watch the video.
Yeah, it can be a struggle. I mean,
And so that's one thing. So they didn't actually pull him out. He wormed his way out the other side intentionally. And then, yeah, and even some of the officers, when they had him on the ground, you could hear some of their voices mentioning, "Hey, check him. Is he all right? Should we move him?"
You hear the expression of concern for sure.
Yes,
Yeah, you do. And
yeah,
you see specifically.
but why didn't they?
I think Officer Lane was the most, and I don't know what
to the point where he lost his mind. He had been pushed so hard for so long that he'd just been pushed to the point where Floyd's behavior to that point for fighting him so hard for so long, his behavior that he'd exhibited was, as soon as he let go, he was going to immediately start fighting him again. So that's why he kept him held in that position, because he knew, because the officer was under the impression that as soon as he moved, Floyd was going to start fighting him again.
Yeah, that's a good take. If I can jump in here, from my perspective, that's the one I would take too, right? And if you combine that, again, there is evidently concern, especially from Officer Lane. He asks specifically about Floyd's eyes are shaking. He says, is that PCP? Because he saw some kind of movement in his eyes, which would be indicative of probably horizontal gaze nystagmus or vertical gaze nystagmus, without getting too in depth in that. But people can look that up if they want. But
this is all related to figuring out what somebody has taken.
Yeah, correct? and so then Lane constantly is making several different statements throughout this, trying to figure out maybe what's wrong with this guy. He even states during this that he says, should we roll him on his side? Chauvin says, no, he's staying put where we got him, which to me goes to what Mike was saying, is that this guy's concerned, Chauvin's concerned that he's going to continue fighting. And then Lane responds, I just worry about the excited delirium or whatever. And Chauvin lastly responds, well, that's why we got the ambulance coming. So it's not like these guys just have reckless disregard with what's going on with this situation. To me, they're dealing with it in respect to what Mike said, is this guy's been fighting them. Chauvin's keeping him on the ground. They're concerned about his well-being, and they're utilizing the principle that I basically was taught, which was ambulance be coming, right? And they're going to control the situation until that ambulance gets there. And that's what I take out of that conversation.
Let's reiterate again. We've said it before. For the public, police are either not trained or very minimally trained medically. And that's across the country. They may be very minimal or not at all trained to deal with medical conditions. And if they suspect something's medically wrong with you, they will call the ambulance. And it appears in this situation, they obviously suspected he was having an issue, and they did call an ambulance. And people misconstrued how the interaction was portraying and why he was being restrained. It wasn't that the officer just wanted to keep him down and wanted to keep his knee on the neck, which, for that amount of time wasn't necessarily a good thing, but he was concerned that this guy was going to continue to fight, because every time they gave this guy a little bit of room, hey, go ahead and sit in the vehicle, he just starts fighting them immediately as soon as they gave him a little bit of room, until they physically moved him to try to get in the vehicle or out of his own. He wouldn't do anything.
Right. And if you look just the next page further into the transcript, you can also see that these police officers are not just focused on what they're dealing with in Floyd himself, but they have a large crowd around them at this point, right? And so a lot of their focus is now being taken to, hey, what's going on around me? Because they're getting yelled at by all these bystanders. So, you even look at, like I said, in the next page of the transcript, and you see Chauvin actually engaging verbally the bystanders, telling them, hey, don't come over here. So his focus at that point is now on other people, because that's a threat from a police officer standpoint.
And there's something to be said with why he had his knee there. He did control him, but with the knee on the neck initially, he was concerned the guy was combative. People grabbed his attention. He focused his attention on everybody else. He thinks he has everything under control. He's got the ambulance coming. He's got the guy restrained, and he's trying to make sure nobody comes and attacks him. Because for those of you out there that aren't familiar in the police environment, it's not just who you're interacting with. And depending on where you are, the spectators have a tendency to interact with the police in a very negative way. And that includes interfering with arrests and all of that. So
you have to maintain scene safety.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. So your focus is now divided, right, between dealing with the person that's the subject that you've been dealing with also dealing with the crowd that's gathering around because they're yelling at you and taking your attention away from what you're doing.
Right. And I believe that there was never an intention to cause this guy's death. There's nobody was really wanting this guy to be injured permanently or dead or anything like that. They're just trying to do from the first step. They were trying to investigate these bills. They were trying to arrest him for that. And it just led down this use of force path where you have the guy who they don't want to get him up because he's going to fight him, and they don't want to continue to fight. They're probably exhausted. They just have him in a restrained position, so he's probably catching his breath, tired, worried about everything that's going on around him. And I know how that exhausted. If you've been fighting for a few minutes straight, you get so very, very exhausted. You can't focus your eyes very well. You get a little bit of blurry vision. Your brain isn't hyper focused anymore, and you're just kind of taking in the situation. And you know, there's a possibility he was in that state where he wasn't really paying 100% attention to what he was doing for a long period of time because of all the scenarios that's going on. So there may be something to be said there. But again, moving a little bit forward, we mentioned it before. The autopsy doesn't say that he was killed by a restricted airway. It was a heart attack, and a knee on the airway doesn't directly cause a heart attack. It just doesn't.
Right. The family autopsy, or the independent one, whatever you want to say, said that he died from mechanical asphyxiation. So, but obviously, I don't want to discredit it, but we know what the motivation there is as well.
Well,
They're trying to win a case.
You do, but the question would be, it's going to be a very odd situation in the courtroom when you have the prosecution using the state's evidence, which will be the official autopsy report, which will somehow conflict. If even the quote independent one would probably not be entered into evidence for a criminal trial, I wouldn't think.
I would assume it would be used as a defense, not necessarily on the. You know what I'm saying?
Well, no, I mean, the defendant is Chauvin and the other police officers, so they're not going to use evidence that would say that what they did.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, you're right. You're correct.
So,
yeah.
but, basically, what you're thinking about is maybe in a civil trial that would work, but the state's office is going to use what, assumingly, would be using the official autopsy report, right? Which is kind of conflicts what their charges are. So it's. And maybe that's a good discussion to have in regards to the charges in general. Maybe aren't exactly accurate.
I think that we should point out too, over this entire thing, that there certainly is a good possibility that these charges may not stick. And I don't know what's going to come of that.
Let's quickly mention these charges, Paul. Can you give us some insight on what is actually is charged right now for Chauvin?
So Chauvin has been charged with, initially was charged with basically third-degree murder, and they decided to up-charge that to second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. So they're kind of hitting him with everything. And in the state of Minnesota, those two things are very similar in regards to causing the death of someone, basically being negligent, and the second-degree murder charge is going to be extremely difficult to prove, which is going to be really interesting. And showing a depraved indifference is going to be extremely difficult to prove because we just discussed that these officers showed apparent concern for his welfare. Right.
Well, what's interesting, in my opinion, is that we talk about these murder charges, and oftentimes murder is brought about by your actions directly causing somebody to have an injury or killing them in some way that causes their death, correct? And in this case, everybody sees the knee on the neck and they're like, oh my gosh, he killed him because he laid there, he was on his neck so long. Well, the knee on the neck doesn't cause a heart attack. So did they cause him to have a heart attack? That's ultimately what we're trying to say here, right? That they caused him to have a heart attack in some way because the on that autopsy it says he had a heart attack. So with all these complicating factors, I don't see how you can prove that one of the police officers caused him to have a heart attack with what I've seen.
Sure, but if you read the statute in Minnesota for an unintentional murder, it says that it causes the death of a human being without intent to affect the death of any person while committing or attempting to commit a felony offense other than criminal sexual conduct, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an unintentional death. So basically they'd say, well, he'd had to have committed a felony, which he didn't. So that doesn't really fit, right?
Right.
So the only other
He wasn't committing a crime at anything.
the only other part of that statute that you will have to prove then is that the murder in the second degree was intentional. So basically saying causes the death of a human being with intent to affect the death of that person or another, but without premeditation.
So basically, we're trying to say that he intended to cause harm to him.
Well, there's two points under the subdivision 2 in the Minnesota statute. It's 609.19 is murder in the second degree in Minnesota. And it does say causes the death of a human being without intent to affect the death of any person while intentionally inflicting or attempting to inflict bodily harm upon the victim.
Yeah, but
that goes on to say some other stuff.
Well, no, yeah, but
you would have to prove that he was intentionally meaning.
No, the other part of that is what excludes that is that it says that it says when the perpetrator is restrained under an order for protection. So that second substatute is basically saying that the victim was under an order of protection from that person, such as like a domestic violence scenario. So that wouldn't obviously qualify in this particular incident. So though the only one in the second degree murder charge that's even relevant to the George Floyd incident has to be the intentional section, because none of the stuff in the unintentional subsection fit. Because he would have to have Chauvin would have to have either been committing or attempting to commit a felony or have an order of protection on him by Floyd, which wasn't the case. So that leads us to subsection 1, which causes the death of a human being with intent to affect the death of that person, but without premeditation. So that's what the prosecutor has to prove, which seems impossible based on the evidence that we have in front of us.
Well, I would have to say that I don't know how, even if he was restricting the guy's airway a bit, and he wasn't able to breathe fully, he didn't die. According to the autopsy, he didn't die from asphyxiation. And so, how do you prove that you're intentionally trying to kill somebody when what you were doing didn't harm them in the manner in which they died? I think that's a little, maybe, legal talk. I'm not a lawyer by any means, but I think it's a little crazy to say you caused somebody's heart attack when you were restraining them because they were being combative, and you were just trying to wait it out so they could get to an ambulance.
Right. And we've been focused on the charges against Chauvin, but the other officers have been charged in aiding and abetting a second degree murder charge. Even Officer Lane, who repeatedly was showing concern for the welfare of Floyd as he was on the ground. And so anyways, the third degree murder charge, which was the initial charge, at least you could make an argument. I don't really see how you can even make a real argument for a second degree murder charge, which looks like this could be a huge setup for a devastating loss by the prosecution at the trial, which will lead to probably complete chaos.
This is This is one of the things I worry about as well. I didn't want George Floyd to die. I don't think anybody did. He did die over, around the circumstances for whatever means that ended up happening. He had a heart attack and died from it. But to say that the legal system in America is designed a certain way, and if you want change, the way to change things in the system is, if you don't like it, the way things happen or why they happen, you try to make change in a peaceable manner. And the way you do that, you can do it in protesting. That's a right given to Americans. But you also have other methods to do it as well, and that includes talking to your representatives, voting, getting involved in your community, and figuring out ways to come around and move us forward. Getting out on the streets on the other end, if you're not protesting, you go out with the protesters and you cause havoc. You've seen it out there. People riot. They catch buildings on fire. They loot. It happens. Obviously, all the protesters aren't involved, but it becomes a riot when people start doing it in any meaningful way. So getting out there and destroying the city is not pushing your point very far. Protesting has a lot more meaning when you're not destroying the city that you want to get better. And I just don't feel like, if the prosecution does lose, I just don't think it's worth destroying the city, killing people, lighting buildings on fire. And the reason I say that is I compare it back to the Rodney King beatings. We're talking about the 91 LA riots. And essentially what happened, the outcome from those riots, was over 60 people died during it, and over $1 billion in property damage. Now, people mark it as a turning point in policy, and it's one way, I guess, to get people's attention by looting and burning and killing. But is it really the moral way or just way to change things? Sorry, 91, 92 riots. But anyway, is it really the moral or just way to provoke change by killing people, by burning places to the ground? I don't see it.
I think you have made a good argument, right? Change does not come through chaos and destruction.
No, a lot of people always use the famous eye for an eye, but they always cut off the back part, which is it makes the whole world blind, right? It never ends. Where do you draw the line? So, but just to kind of touch on the end of what you guys were talking about with the charges, I don't see how the second-degree murder charge is going to stand, and therefore with the officers that were assisting, that's all going to go away. I just don't see how that's going to stick.
Right. And well, that's all I think we got for today on this topic. As things come to light, we'll touch back into this topic, especially as we see prosecution move forward, or if anything pops up in those regards. But check us out next week, where we continue our discussions. You can look at us on Twitter at Oxygen Podcast. We do have a Facebook up now, and that will be posted, and we'll be back next week for more into the police and military deaths.